All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This will be a lecture. I think this lecture will encompass both Junot Daz and Jhumpa Lahiri. I'd like to pair them together because I think that they were two writers of the same generation who were acclaimed as short story writers at first, though they later did publish novels. They sort of came on the scene with short story collections in the 1990s. And while there are many differences in their works and in their styles and in their subject matter, I think they have a couple things in common. One, if, as we talked about David Foster Wallace and George Saunders using elements of genre fiction and magical realism in their works, as both of them did, and signaled a moving away from the idea that literary fiction had to be realistic, that's one thing, but on the other hand, realist fiction didn't go away and remained a potent force, and I think if anything was given a new lease on life by the new sincerity, because while Saunders and Wallace use satire in some, sometimes science fictional techniques of satire to poke fun at their society, I think in many ways realism is the most natural choice for a writer who wants to be sincere, who wants to be earnest, because realism is where you write kind of directly about the experiences that you see around you. So in Díaz and Lahiri, we have this continuation of the realist tradition in American fiction, though Díaz will also use science fictional and fantastical and magical realist elements in other works of his. They're not the one we're reading here. Then I think the other thing they share in common is they are both writers of the immigrant experience, and this was emphasized in the Norton bios of both writers. They emphasize the globalization of literature in the late 20th and early 21st century. As their bios both note, one of the ways in which the immigrant experience differed in the later 20th century than from the way it had been before is that communications technology, rapidity of travel, and also I think the multicultural movement in America, which led to a de-emphasis on assimilation, all of these things led to American culture feeling more globalized. There wasn't this expectation anymore that you would come to America from somewhere else and you would leave your language, you would leave your culture behind, you wouldn't communicate with your what family and friends you had back in the old country. All of that sort of went away, and it became much more possible for cultures and languages and ways of life to sort of be circulating globally. And so particularly in Díaz's work, which is multilingual in some of the same ways that Gloria Ansel-Dua's had been, you see this mark on the page, multiple languages meeting each other. And then in Lahiri's work, her work is often set in India and the United States, and she writes from multiple perspectives of the Indian and Indian American experiences. Now, there are differences in their works, mostly in terms of class. Junot Daz writes from a working class perspective, and Jhumpa Lahiri writes mainly from the perspective of the professional professional middle classes, the educated classes, and so they're generally treating two very different versions of that immigrant experience as affected by class. And I think you can see that clearly in these two stories, where the characters in Díaz's story are almost defined by their lack of economic opportunity, and the characters in Lahiri's story just seem to have, economically speaking, the world at their fingertips, can just take a plane whenever they want, go to fancy restaurants, etc. So we're definitely dealing with two different worlds of class experience, but both of them, I think, are realist writers in their short stories of this globalized immigrant experience. So let's take both of their stories together then. And the one thing, though, is these are, I think, being realist stories of the new sincere era, they're somewhat, I think, straightforward, maybe more straightforward than some of the other fiction we've been reading. We don't have the intense complications that we find in something like Toni Morrison's Recitative or Thomas Pynchon's Entropy. or Louise Erdrich's Fleur. These are somewhat more forthright. These are realist stories in the way I was saying realist stories tended to work at the beginning of the class. They're written in fairly transparent language, and they make their themes fairly clear, though there are subtle aspects to them. But in many ways, they're working in that Raymond Carver tradition, where there's a kind of minimal use of language that would in any way befuddle you or make you unclear as to what the meaning of the story was. So, Junot Daz, he was born in 1968 in the Dominican Republic. He immigrated with his family to New Jersey when he was 6, and often his work reflects this background, and sometimes his work is set in the Dominican Republic. He had a difficult relationship with his father, of the kind narrated in Drown. He received a bachelor's degree from Rutgers and his MFA, so he has an MFA, from Cornell, and he currently teaches at MIT. And he is renowned, as I was just explaining, for his multilingual stories of working-class immigrant urban life, often with an emphasis on the influence of pop culture and on the ideology of masculinity. That might be another difference between his work and Lahiri's. He does tend to write from this masculine point of view. Lahiri is a little bit more diverse in terms of the gender of the viewpoint character. She's not as clearly autobiographical a writer as Díaz is, and will often write from a male perspective. Or as you see in the story we read, Sexy, she writes from about Indian characters from the perspective of a white character in that one. So she's Díaz, I think, is much more rooted in a kind of autobiographical narrator, whereas Lahiri is much more all over the place in terms of her narrator. And as I said, he has this semi-autobiographical narrator through most of his work named Junior. Now, it is only a semi-autobiographical narrator, so I don't think we can sort of take this as like a memoir in any way. But nevertheless, there is a kind of autobiographical tone to Díaz's work that isn't there necessarily in Lahiri's. Her work is much more clearly invented. So they talk about, in the Norton bio, they talk about Díaz's use of Spanglish, the slang term for such colorful mixtures of Spanish and English as you find in Díaz's work, and as a poetry of sorts, it contributes to the texture and rhythm of Díaz's narration. As O'Rourke puts it, his fiction is propelled by its attention to the energetic hybridity of American life, stretching from the questions of identity and inclusion dealt with in the stories of Drown to the complexities of a multicultural boyhood depicted in his novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. So I think Drown is an interesting story because it's not very heavily plotted. It's a story that doesn't have a very kind of overbearing narrative architecture. It's more of a set of slices of life of our narrator. It centers around this one theme, which is his relationship to his friend Beto, who's gone away to college, it seems like to Rutgers. There's a mention of Rutgers isn't mentioned by name, but it's kind of alluded to that's where he's gone to college, where Junior has stayed in the neighborhood and become a drug dealer to supplement his income. And so we get these the story is kind of cross-cut, to use cinematic language, between Junior's life in the present when Beto comes back for a visit, and Junior's relationship with his mother, and his mother's strained relationship with his father, who lives in Florida and is begging the mother for money and wants the mother to come down and live with them, and his kind of criminal activity and his fear that he'll be caught and arrested, and his ambivalence over whether he wants to see Beto or not. And he makes reference, a rather crude reference, at the very beginning of the story that Beto has sort of come out as gay, and that's one of the reasons he doesn't want to see him. There seems to be this kind of homophobia within this culture that Junior inhabits. And what you gradually understand over the course of the story, and what's essentially revealed at the end of the story, is that Junior's kind of homophobic response to Beto and his desire to avoid him stems from the fact that they actually had two sexual encounters, and that Junior and Beto have in effect had this sexual experience that kind of echoes in the realm of sex, their closeness of their emotional life. And that's why I think the two passages I chose to use to exemplify this story I call the slide Submerged Classes and Submerged Sexualities, because the title of the story is Drown, and there's this recurrent imagery of being at the pool and Beto pushing Junior under. And I think that image has two meanings. On the one, it has two meanings. On the one hand, there's a class meaning. That Junior and Beto grew up as part of this submerged class. They were these working class kids. They were even part of what I think Marxists have generally called the lumpen proletariat. Like, they formally belong to the working class, but they don't work, and they're sort of forced into unemployment and into criminal activity to keep their heads above water, to pursue the drowning motif. And so they're part of this submerged class. But because they both have these intellectual ambitions, they both read, even though Beto is the one who sort of has the stereotype of being the more learned one. And in this moment earlier in the story, Junior has used a kind of a piece of educated language. I don't remember specifically what it is. And Beto's like, tell me how you learned that. He hated when I knew something he didn't. He put his hands on my shoulders and pushed me under. He was wearing a cross and cut-off jeans. He was stronger than me and held me down until water flooded my nose and throat. Even then I didn't tell him. He thought I didn't read, not even dictionaries. So Beto is submerging Junior because Beto is able to escape this class. He's able to go to college. He's able to leave this kind of homophobic society and come out and live as a gay man. And so he kind of leaves Junior submerged in this world. On the other hand, though, I think the drowning motif has a more positive meaning, which is, I call it submerged sexuality. So there's a negative meaning, which is the closet in which you have to live in this homophobic society if you are queer. And so I think in that sense, this sexuality is submerged. But I also think the more positive reference of drowning in this story is you're sort of submerged in your own uncontrollable and liquid and fluid and uncontainable desire, and that is what they feel together. And so we have this narration of their two sexual encounters. And after the first one, Junior essentially sort of leaves and doesn't know what to do with himself or how to react. But then he goes and sees Beto at the pool the next night, and he says, Beto says to him, let's go, unless of course you're not feeling good. I'm feeling fine, I said, which is essentially an invitation, essentially consent that they're going to have another sexual encounter. So they go back. Since his parents worked nights, we pretty much owned the place until 6 the next morning. We sat in front of his television in our towels, his hands bracing against my abdomen and thighs. I'll stop if you want, he said, and I didn't respond. After I was done, he laid his head in my lap. I wasn't asleep or awake, but caught somewhere in between, rocked slowly back and forth the way surf holds junk against the shore, rolling it over and over. So we have this image of water as almost a cradle rocking him after he's had this seemingly positive sexual experience. And this is contrasted with his sort of tormented thoughts about the ways he remains submerged in a class position. And he has this flashback to his teacher telling him, a few of you are going to make it, those are the orbiters, but the majority of you are just going to burn out, going nowhere. He dropped his hand onto his desk. I could already see myself losing altitude, fading, the earth spread out beneath me hard and bright. So we have this positive connotation of drowning in this pleasure, of this pleasurable sexual interaction with his best friend, contrasted poignantly with the negative connotation of drowning in this class position he doesn't seem to be able to get out of. And you'll note, though, that there's no sense of postmodern irony in this story. The emotions are expressed earnestly. The ironies are... I think the main irony in this story is the irony that Junior initially, postures as this homophobic masculine figure, and then you later learn that actually he's had these sexual experiences with his best friend. But again, the irony... that's not irony that you don't know the meaning of. The meaning of it is that it was unfortunate that he felt the need to deny this part of himself. It's irony with a clearly pointed moral purpose and a clearly poignant emotional effect. So that I think is what there is to say about Drown by Junot Daz. I mean, there's more we could say, but I think for our purposes and putting this in the context of the new sincerity and of the continuation of realist fiction into the 21st century, I think that's what I would want to say. I now want to move on within this same lecture to Jhumpa Lahiri then. So Jhumpa Lahiri was born in London in 1967 to Bengali parents who later immigrated to the US, and she was raised in Rhode Island and educated at Barnard and Boston College. And she's renowned for her realist stories focused on the Indian and Indian American experience from multiple points of view, and has taught creative writing and published several more collections of stories and novels. And like Junot Daz, both of these writers, Díaz and Lahiri, came on the scene in the late 90s with short story collections that were enormously successful, more successful than story collections tended to be. In fact, this was also true of Saunders, who came on the scene in the 90s with story collections. So they are sort of reviving the American short story, and Lahiri's collection was called Interpreter of Maladies. Díaz's collection was called Drown, so what we read was the title story. And both of them seemed to be revelatory windows upon this global immigrant experience, even though Lahiri is writing about a very different culture and class from the one Díaz is writing about. They're both writing about the ways in which American society has become multicultural through these stories of global immigration. So they say in the bio in the Norton, when Jhumpa Lahiri writes, her setting is quite literally the world, focused sometimes here and sometimes there, but always with global implications. This orientation is a factor of her times. Unlike children of earlier immigrant generations, Lahiri did not face the pressure of assimilation, or did not face the pressures of assimilating into an American society apart from and in some cases above other cultures. Instead, she's able to live out a much more multicultural experience. And you might contrast the story, I think, Sexy by Lahiri contrasts with is Two Kinds by Amy Tan. In Two Kinds, you had the story of a daughter sort of being forced to try to assimilate into American culture, a daughter of a Chinese American family being forced to assimilate into American culture. In Sexy, the narrative viewpoint is that of a white American who is in some way trying to assimilate into Indian culture because her best friend is Indian, her lover is Indian, and she has all of these experiences where she's trying to learn more about the culture. And I think that shows the way in which that ideal of assimilation and of the melting pot totally broke down by the beginning of the 21st century. And it was just accepted that America would be I think the contrasting metaphor to the melting pot is the salad bowl. It's not that different cultures would melt into one, which was the old ideal of American immigration, but that different cultures would coexist side by side, and that there might be a kind of melding of them at the margins and at their borders, but that they wouldn't melt into one thing. So this is almost a reversal of that story of assimilation. This is a story of how the new cultures that immigrants bring with them might be attractive to people who are not children of immigrants, or at least not of recent immigrants. So, and that suggests this kind of this globalization of culture and this globalization of life, which is enabled by the globalization of capital, because these are characters of immense economic privilege. So I call my first slide Global Capital with an S in parentheses, so global capital, but also global capitals, because what happens in this story, so we have our main character, Miranda. She's our viewpoint character. This is a story written in the limited third-person perspective. So it's written in the third person, but it's always from Miranda's perspective. And again, note Lahiri's confidence. And if you read more of her stories, you'll see her confidence even more sharply, because she writes from the point of view of old people and of young people, of men and of women, of white people and of Indians, of people who live in India and have never left India, and of Indian Americans who have some who immigrated, some who were born in the United States. So she is pretty fearless when it comes to writing from all sorts of different perspectives. She does not fear inhabiting different viewpoints and voices. And so this story, I think, shows that by having this white American narrator reflecting on her encounters with these Indian characters. So she's having an affair with a married man who's Bengali named Dev, and Miranda really doesn't know anything about Indian subcontinent, its politics, its cultures, anything like that. And so this story is a process of her trying to learn more about it. And there's a moment where she says Dev was Bengali too, just like her friend at work, Lakshmi. She says, Dev was Bengali too. At first, Miranda thought it was a religion, but then he pointed it out to her, a place in India called Bengal, and a map printed in an issue of not just any magazine, but The Economist, which is the sort of British magazine that's read the world over by people who are concerned with economics, people who might be invested in financial markets. It's a magazine you have to sort of be rich enough to read. I don't usually read The Economist. So he had brought the magazine specially to her apartment, for she did not own an atlas or any other books with maps in them. He pointed to the city where he'd been born and another city where his father had been born. One of the cities had a box around it intended to attract the reader's eye. When Miranda asked what the box indicated, Dev rolled up the magazine and said, "Nothing you'll ever need to worry about," and he tapped her playfully on the head. So we even have this sort of condescension that he, there's this greater, if you're a white American who's not descended from recent immigrants, there's this sort of ignorance you carry around with you. And a character like Dev, now there's a bit of masculine condescension, there's a gendered element to the way in which he's condescending to her as well. And I don't necessarily think we're to judge his character as in a wholly positive light throughout this story. But there's also this just, he almost enjoys her naivete, that she could sort of be this sheltered from the world. But then later in the story, so there's been this subplot of Lakshmi's, I forget, one of Lakshmi's relatives, her husband met this woman on an airplane and just abandoned the family. And so this woman eventually comes to visit, and Lakshmi is going to take her out to cheer her up, and she leaves her son with Miranda, and Miranda plays this kind of game with him where she quizzes him on the names of the world, of the capitals of the countries of the world, in a world almanac. And I think the idea that this 7-year-old kid is trying to learn this information that Miranda, as an adult woman, didn't know, shows the way in which, in this world of global capitalism, knowledge of the world becomes absolutely mandatory for everyone and something you need to know from the earliest point in your life. And this is something that's just dawning on Miranda early in her adulthood, that there's been this lack of knowledge. So global capital, the globalization of capital, means that if you want to be a part of this class, you have to know the global capitals. You have to know something about the cultures of the world. And I think that's the meaning of this image of her asking him, quizzing him on the global capitals. However, I also think that this story isn't purely sort of positive about globalization. I think this story at least shows the ways in which it has some costs. And I think part of the cost is the way in which no relationship in this story is stable. We begin with Lakshmi telling Miranda the story of her relative whose husband meets a woman on a plane, falls in love with her, and decides to stay in London and abandon the family. Then Miranda begins an affair with Dev that obviously can't last because he's going to stay married to his wife, and their relationship doesn't last the length of the story. It's over by the time the story is over. And then we have this little boy, Rohin, Rohin, forgive my pronunciation, who is sort of just going all over the world. He's lost his father, and as Miranda thinks, he was used to it now, the sound of a woman crying. So this idea that no relationship is stable, that all relationships are transitory, that desire is as migratory as people, to invoke the name of my slide. And this moment in the story from which it takes its title is where her and Dev go to this museum exhibit called the Maparium in Boston. And this is a real place, and I've put an image from it that I found online on my slide, where you go in and as Miranda recalls, in the Maparium that day, all the countries had seemed close enough to touch. And then it's a kind of whispering gallery. And so Dev sends her to the other end of it and whispers, "You're sexy," and she can hear it. So there's this acoustical effect where very softly uttered things can be heard at a great distance. So there's this illusion of intimacy, this illusion of global intimacy that all the countries had seemed close enough to touch, but it creates this disruption of relationships. It creates this lack of intimacy, this failure of intimacy, as desire is so migratory, as everyone is having affairs with everyone else in all these different countries, and no relationship is permanent. And the other thing that happens in the story is this word sexy is a motif. So Dev says it to her in the Maparium, and then Rowan says it to her as they're looking at the atlas, and she says, "What does sexy mean to you?" And he says something like, it's how you feel about somebody when you don't know them very well, or it's how you feel. I should have put the line on the slide. Hold on, I have the book right here. I'm sorry, I didn't remember. It means loving someone you don't know, is what he says. So sexy, this kind of superficial relation, all relations have been reduced to this superficiality. You never fully come to know anyone, and you can't, because everybody is sort of migrating all the time, and their desires are migrating all the time. So this has been a coming of age story for Miranda, and Dev says he admires her for moving to Boston, where she knew no one, instead of remaining in Michigan, where she'd grown up. And he says, "I know what it's like to be lonely." So even she has internally migrated within the country, as so many people do. I think that even if you don't leave your country to go somewhere else, I think it's much more common in the United States now to end up working in a place where you didn't grow up, because you moved there for your education or for a job. And so everyone is permanently on the move. We have this itinerant migratory society. And I think what's so beautiful about this story is that it shows you what's good about that in the way that Miranda comes of age by opening her mind to other cultural influences and to a more global sense of reality on the one hand, but it also shows what's lost with this globalization, which is a loss of any sense of place, of any sense of permanency, and a creation of this state where everyone knows what it's like to be lonely. And so that, and that, I think, is what this story is about, and I think that's the way in which this story is sincere. It's ambivalent about this. Is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, it's a mixed bag, but it's not ironic. It's not a story where you don't know what to think about anything by the end. And so in that way, it's, I think, an earnest, a sincere, realist story about the experience of, the benefits of, and the price of our new globalized reality. So that's Junot Daz and Jhumpa Lahiri, and that's the end of this lecture. Thanks very much and have a great day.